Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Landowner Transparency Act Policy webinar. Today's session will be presented by Ruben Danicotti, who is the Director and Administrator of Landowner Transparency Registry Services, and Shannon Brand-John, Deputy Administrator of Landowner Transparency Registry Services at the Land, Title and Survey Authority of British Columbia. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question and answer field on the right side of your screen. After the presentation, Ruben and Shannon will provide verbal responses to your questions during a Q&A session. I will now turn the presentation over to Ruben to begin. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Janice. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to register for this webinar and for taking an interest in the Landowner Transparency Registry. So today, Shannon and I will cover a series of agenda items, and it's a pretty heavy session that we have planned today. So without further ado, we're going to get into the presentation. And as Janice mentioned, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers after the session. So first of all, we'll cover a bit of a background on LOTA as to how LOTA evolved from the creation of the new legislation, Landowner Transparency Act, to this point where we're getting ready to go live with the registry. We'll also give you a bit of a perspective on the scheduled timing of LOTA. There's some key dates that we will cover. And then we'll get into some of the heavier material, which is really some key definitions, key concepts as covered by the Landowner Transparency Act. And then, of course, as of September 20th, 2020, there was the introduction of the Landowner Transparency Regulation by way of OIC 549. And we're going to cover certain key concepts that were introduced through that regulation. Then we'll get into the registry searches, applications that can be made to the administrator, and quality control mechanisms that are available to ensure the maintenance of the registry. We'll also share with you the registry fees, which will cover all the various filing fees and application fees. And compliance and enforcement as a distinction between the enforcement function versus the administrator of LOTA function. And then we'll also give you a bit of a quick run through of the landtransparency.ca website, which provides some very useful content and resources for you. And then finally, as I mentioned, questions and answers. The slide deck that you're going to be seeing is currently available in landtransparency.ca, so you can also use that as a resource following this session. So I'm going to hand it back first to Shannon, and she will take us through the first part of the presentation, and I will be back on the second part. Thank you.
All right. So I wanted to start today with the background of how the Landowner Transparency Act, which we'll refer to as LOTA, and the Landowner Transparency Registry, which we'll refer to as LOTR, came to be. So it started in 2018, and this was the first public disclosure of the Landowner Transparency Act when the provincial government released their budget. And in that budget included a 30-point plan for housing affordability in BC. And in that plan was an action to end hidden ownership through the creation of a beneficial ownership registry. Since the budget was released, there was public consultation on feedback in 2018, and in June 2018, the province released a white paper and a draft of LOTA for more public review and feedback. That brought us to May 2019, when LOTA received royal assent, and it will be brought into force November 30th, 2020, and that was through the Landowner Transparency Regulation, Ordering Council 549. Since that time, the LTSA has been building and operationalizing the Landowner Transparency Registry. It's the first of its kind in Canada, and there's very few examples of registries like these around the world. So this has been a very large undertaking. It's included translating legislation into policy and procedures, creating business processes, system design, and IT development, as well as training our own staff, external customers, users, and performing internal and external user testing. In August 2020, the LOTA amendments, Bill 13, received royal assent, and the main parts in the amendments included the tweaking of language, particularly around Section 30 and 35, which is the public search function of LOTA, and also the introduction of Section 17.1, which is the notice the administrator if a corporation, trust, or partnership ceases to be a reporting body, and I'll get into that more later. And most recently, September 2020, the Landowner Transparency Regulation passed. Again, that's Order in Council 549. And in the regulation stated the in-force state as well as the meaning of indirect control, which I will also get into more later in the presentation. For scheduled timing of LOTA, as I mentioned, the LOTA regulations passed September 2020, and in the regulations had the in-force dates. So this is starting November 30th, 2020 is when LOTA filings will become available, and this is in just over a month. And in April 30th, 2021 is when LOTA search will begin. So this is the public and regulatory body search of LOTA. About the Landowner Transparency Act. So LOTA introduces mandatory reporting about indirect ownership of land. So these are ownership interests that are not reflected in the land title register. And this information will be housed in a searchable public database called the Landowner Transparency Registry. All transferees, so those being transferred an interest in land, must disclose if they are a reporting body as defined in LOTA. And the reporting body is either a relevant corporation, a relevant trust, or a relevant partnership. Transferees that are reporting bodies must further disclose identifying information about themselves and about indirect owners of the interest in land. The indirect owners are called interest holders in LOTA. So who are reporting bodies? As I mentioned previously, LOTA describes three types of reporting bodies: relevant corporations, relevant trusts, and relevant partnerships. Each is a legal entity or relationship capable of owning land and for which there are distinct legal and beneficial owners. So for relevant corporations under LOTA, this includes all private corporations and limited liability corporations, unless exempt by Schedule 1, and Schedule 1 is found at the end of LOTA. Some exemption examples from Schedule 1 include strata corporations, government bodies, local governments, and schools. The second type of reporting body is a relevant trust. So this includes all express intentional trusts, unless exempt by Schedule 2. Again, Schedule 2 is found at the end of LOTA. Some exemption examples include testamentary trusts, charitable trusts, and the public guardian and trustee. And a note that bare trusts, also known as nominees, are considered relevant trusts in LOTA. And finally, the third type of reporting body is a relevant partnership. And now that includes all partnerships. Who are interest holders? So each type of reporting body has a specific type of interest holder with a specific definition. The first type is the corporate interest holder, which is the interest holder for a relevant corporation. And this is someone who owns or controls, alone with others, directly or indirectly, 10% or more of the equity, typically shares or voting rights, or is someone who has the right, directly or indirectly, to appoint or remove a majority of the directors. For a relevant trust, the interest holder is a beneficial owner. So this is someone who has a beneficial interest in the interest in land, power to revoke the trust and receive the interest in land, a corporate interest holder of a corporation that has a beneficial interest in the land or the power to revoke the trust and receive the interest in land, and finally, the partnership interest holder for the relevant partnership reporting body. And this is a partner in the relevant partnership or a corporate interest holder of a corporation who is a partner in the relevant partnership. The Landowner Transparency Regulation. So this is Order in Council 549. And as discussed earlier, it was passed September 20th, 2020. So in this slide, I'll be going over the meaning of indirect control. So this is something that is described in the regulation over 4 pages and 15 sections. And it's a very complex concept, and I've attempted to keep it as concise and clear as possible over one slide. So I'm just going to read this slide slowly, line by line, to ensure that I'm communicating it as intended. So the Landowner Transparency Regulation is key in providing guidance to trace through layers of a particular ownership structure to determine the individuals who must be disclosed in a transparency report under LOTA. Part 2 of the regulation defines key terms, relevant intermediary and a chain of intermediaries, and provides rules for determining indirect control as necessary to disclose the interest holders of a relevant corporation. Notably, relevant intermediary is defined as a person that is one or more of the following and is controlled by another person. This includes a relevant corporation, a relevant partnership, a trustee of a relevant trust, an agent, whether an individual, relevant corporation, or trustee of a relevant trust, a personal or other legal representative, whether an individual, relevant corporation, relevant partnership, or trustee of a relevant trust. And a note here that a person may be a natural or a non-natural person, for example, a corporation, whereas an individual is a natural person or a human being. Chain of relevant intermediaries is defined as a group of 2 or more relevant intermediaries having a hierarchical relationship to each other in which the first relevant intermediary in the chain is controlled by an individual who is not a relevant intermediary, and each relevant intermediary in the chain controls the relevant intermediary below it. As can be seen, the rules of indirect control are detailed and technical in nature, requiring close attention to detail to ensure that the ultimate interest holders of a complex corporate structure are properly disclosed. And LOTA does not require the disclosure of relevant intermediaries in transparency reports. This is meaning to say that only the ultimate interest holders are disclosed. About the Landowner Transparency Act. So interest in land is defined in the Landowner Transparency Act, and these interests in land require a LOTA disclosure. The first type of interest in land is an estate in fee simple. The second is a life estate. The third is a right to occupy under lease. So this is a term of greater than 10 years that is registered on title. The fourth is a right to occupy or require transfer under agreement for sale. And the fifth is a prescribed right, which may come in the future by regulation. And the exempted lands are under Section 6 of LOTA. And these exempted lands, unless the owner is excluded, it includes all owners, not just those of First Nations. So this includes treaty lands, recognized self-governing First Nation lands, which includes Sechelt, Niska, Manluf, and Flamen, reserve lands, and prescribed lands. For these Section 6 exempt lands, LOTA disclosures are not required. So when are LOTA disclosures required? There's 4 triggering events that prompt a LOTA disclosure being required. The first is registration. So on application to register a legal interest in land, a 2-tiered obligation is triggered. Each transferee, that is someone being transferred an interest in land, must file a transparency declaration indicating if they are a reporting body, and if so, which type. The second is that a reporting body must also file a transparency report disclosing specified information about each interest holder. So that is to say that in most cases, unless excluded or exempt, each interest in land that is being transferred will require a transparency declaration. And that transparency declaration is simply asking if the transferee is a reporting body or not. If they are not, they do not require a transparency report. And if they are, they would go out to fill out the longer transparency report disclosing more information. The second triggering event is pre-existing owners. So this came into force by the LOTA regulations. And this is that reporting bodies that are currently on title, those who own an interest in land when LOTA comes into force, will have to file a transparency report by November 30th, 2021. So that gives pre-existing owners 1 year from the in-force date of November 30th, 2020 to file their initial transparency report. The third triggering event is a change in interest holders. So each time the interest holders in a reporting body change, the reporting body must file an updated transparency report. The fourth triggering event is when a registered owner ceases to be a reporting body. So this is section 17.1 that came through with the LOTA amendments. And this is a notice to the administrator required if a corporation, trust, or partnership ceases to be a relevant corporation, relevant trust, or relevant partnership. So an example of this may be that a relevant corporation goes public and is now on the stock exchange. They would be exempt under Schedule 1 and no longer required to have a transparency report. So they would file this section 17.1 notice to the administrator to have their transparency report be made historical. There's a note here that reporting bodies must also choose to file a new transparency report at any other time to complete or correct information in a previously filed transparency report. I will now pass it to Ruben to speak about the role of the registrar in LOTA filings.
Thank you, Shannon. So the role of the Registrar of Land Titles is pretty integral in LOTA. And the role of the registrar is limited to this. So first of all, as Shannon mentioned, on every application to register an interest in land, LOTA filings are required. So the registrar's role in terms of receiving applications for land title applications is limited to ensuring that first, that the submissions include the requisite LOTA filings. So the manner in which the transparency declarations and transparency reports are filed is that first, LOTA requires that they are submitted to the Registrar of Land Titles, and then they get filed with the LOTA administrator. The registrar under LOTA must refuse to accept an application to register an interest in land if it is not accompanied by the required LOTA filings, transparency declaration and transparency report if required. Then there's three other requirements, and that is the registrar has to ensure that the transparency declaration and the transparency report have been properly certified, signed, and submitted. So we'll talk about certification here. Certification is done by a person that has the knowledge of the facts contained in the document and who has the authority to sign on behalf of the transferee or the reporting body. So as an example, it could be the trustee of the reporting body, or it could be a director of a corporation, for example. So really the certification is done by this person who has the authority to sign the transparency report on behalf of the reporting body. The next requirement is that the subscriber, in this case, typically it's the legal professional, whether it's a lawyer, notary, for example, it must confirm that the true copy of the document has been certified. And by this, I mean that the certification must be actually wet ink signed. We'll talk about that shortly. Must be actually wet ink signed before it's electronically submitted. So the subscriber is ensuring that the true copy has been certified before applying their electronic Juris Cert signature to electronically submit the LOTA forms. Any manual declarations, and by this we mean any paper forms, declarations and reports, must be wet ink signed at all times if they are being submitted manually. And again, submitted means the manner in which LOTA documents are filed. That is, reports are submitted to the registrar and then filed with the LOTA administrator. And last but not least, all fees associated with LOTA must be paid at the point of submission. So those are really the key requirements and the obligations of the registrar. The registrar's role does not extend to verifying or confirming the information contained in transparency declarations and transparency reports. So there will be no defecting of any of those submissions whatsoever. So the next we'll cover what information is contained in a transparency report. So there's a series of information, 6 categories particularly, that must be disclosed in a transparency report. The first category is what is called primary identifying information about a reporting body. And so depending on the type of reporting body, whether it's an individual, a corporation, or a partnership, so depending on that, the types of information that must be disclosed does vary. And the primary identifying information is covered under sections 7, 8, and 9 of LOTA. So as an example, an individual, let's say a trustee or settler of a relevant trust, The required information would be the name, citizenship or permanent residence, city and province, country of residence, if in Canada or not, and incorporation number and jurisdiction. In the case of, actually, the incorporation and jurisdiction number will be part of the corporation information. So then, as far as a relevant corporation or limited liability company, it is the name of the corporation, the registered office address and a head office address, if applicable, and the jurisdictions of incorporation. And as far as a partnership is concerned, it's the registered business name, the type of partnership. So for example, limited or general partnership, the registered and or head office address, if applicable, and then the jurisdiction of laws which govern that partnership. So again, these required information are set out in section 7, 8, and 9 of LOTA. The second category of information is about the interest holders, which are to be disclosed within the transparency report. So the types of information required will be the date of birth, the address, the social insurance number, an individual tax number if assigned by CRA, a residence for tax purposes, and then the description of interest that's held in the reporting body. For example, ownership of 25% of the voting shares and so forth. Then there's specific information that is also required about the reporting body. That is, in the case of a corporation, the business number and the incorporation number. And in the case of a trust, information about the settlor and the Land Title Act trust instrument number, if available. And then there's be various information about the partnership that will be required to be disclosed. And finally, the last two pieces of information is the parcel identifier, or known as the PID, that is assigned to the land for which the report relates to. And the name and contact of the person signing, certifying the report, as I mentioned, the person with the knowledge about the reporting body. So what level of due diligence is required in the preparation of report? So the obligation really in preparation of the report lies solely on the reporting bodies. So the Act is very clear that the reporting bodies must take reasonable steps to obtain and confirm the accuracy of all information in a transparency report. And there's a reciprocal obligation as well for interest holders to provide the requested information to those reporting bodies so that they can do the requisite filings. There are offenses in relation to non-compliance to not provide that information, and that's covered under the enforcement section of the Act. So what if reporting bodies are unable to obtain all of the required information? So the Act provides a provision there for reporting bodies to provide a summary of explanation as to how, what steps were taken to obtain the information, and what were the limitations in obtaining some of those information. So it's a bit of an ability to explain the steps taken and why the information was not able to be verified and obtained. The obligation is also upon the reporting body that when the reporting body becomes aware that an interest holder may be incapable of managing their affairs, so if an individual has become incapacitated, the reporting body must take reasonable steps to determine if that is so, and then disclose that in the transparency report. There's a final obligation as set out in section 24 of the Act, and that is the reporting body must take reasonable steps to notify each interest holder that is identified in the transparency report before it is filed. And so the notification requirements are as follows. So first, under section 24, the reporting body must notify information about the interest holder or settlor. To notify the reporting body must notify each interest holder or settlor that this information is required under the Act and is being disclosed in a transparency report. The second, that the individual has the right under section 40 to make an application to omit information if health or safety at risk, and request that some or all of the information may be omitted from publicly searchable from public search. And then the third notification is that unless the individual makes a request under Section 40 to omit information, that within 90 days after filing of the transparency report, all of the information contained in the primary identification information about an individual becomes available for public search. So that's the notification requirement that's required before the transparency report gets filed. So we'll cover registry searches and the types of applications to the administrator, and of course, quality control mechanisms to maintain the quality of the registry. So first of all, effective April 30th, 2021, the public will be able to search the registry, but the public can only obtain a subset of information, again called as the primary identification information, about reporting bodies and interest holders and settlers. There's only two ways that the public can search, and this is actually covered under Section 30 and 35 of the Act, and that's by way of searching by a parcel identifier to determine who the reporting bodies are and interest holders under those reporting bodies and settlers associated in the case of trusts. The second search is by way of a name, so a name of either a reporting body or an individual, to determine what interests in land are held by those respective reporting bodies, interest holders, or settlers. Also effective April 30th, 2021, there are certain entities, regulators, and authorities that are entitled to search all of the information contained in what's called transparency records. That includes transparency declarations, transparency reports, and reported information. So those five entities are the enforcement officer, the Ministry of Finance employees, taxing authority employees, so that covers any laws of which there's taxing authorities are covered under the law of BC or law of Canada. So that, for example, does include the Canada Revenue Agency, BC Assessment Authority, and British Columbia taxing authorities. The fourth is law enforcement officers. That's any officer within the meaning of the Police Act, and also includes the RCMP officers. Finally, there's a category of regulators that includes the BC Securities Commission, FICOM, which has been currently rebranded to BCFSA, FINTRAC, and the Law Society of BC. So applications. So there's two types of applications to the administrator, and I'll cover that shortly. So these two applications and the Section 17.1 notice to the administrator that Shannon covered earlier are the only three applications and notices that get filed directly to the administrator, so they do not have to be submitted to the registrar. So the first application is an application to omit under Section 40 of the Act. And so this is where a person may apply to have their primary identifying information removed from public search on reasonable belief of threat to health or safety to themselves or to a member of their household. So there are certain requirements under this section of the Act. So the individual must provide evidence to support the request. And the administrator also may require additional supporting records or other information to substantiate the application. And lastly, there is an obligation by the Act for the administrator to immediately omit the information upon receipt of this application, despite the fact that there may be a pending review and determination. So upon receiving it immediately, we will immediately, if we can match the information in the database immediately, we will suppress that information. The second application is an application under Section 42 of LOTA to correct or change information. So here, a person may apply to requests that corrections be made to file transparency reports or to publicly accessible information to either correct an incomplete or inaccurate information. But before doing so, the requirement under Section 42 is that a person must first make that request to the reporting body to revise that information. So if after 3 months from the time the person makes the request to the reporting body, if that change has not been made, then only can the person apply directly to the administrator to request those changes. And again, requisite evidence to support the application will be required, and the administrator may also require further additional supporting records. So quality control mechanisms, the LOTA does provide two key provisions. So the LOTA administrator and the enforcement officer have fairly broad authority to make certain changes on their own initiative. So the first of all, the LOTA administrator may omit or obscure information from public accessibility if the administrator considers that there is a risk to the health or safety of an individual. The administrator also can annotate a filed transparency record in a manner that, however, in a manner that does not conceal the original content of a transparency record. The administrator can also make changes to reported or publicly accessible information. Finally, with the enforcement officer, a distinct role from the administrator's role per LOTA. So on a conclusion of a particular inspection or investigation, the enforcement officer may have determined that certain file information may be incomplete or inaccurate, and the enforcement officer as such can direct the administrator to omit or obscure the information that is publicly accessible, to annotate the file transparency report, and then also to make changes to reported or publicly accessible information. So registry fees. So the LTSA has broad authority to charge fees under LOTA, and it's the LTSA board of directors that set those fees. So the first fee in transparency declaration is $5. The filing of a transparency report is $35. So in most of your transactions where you're only filing a transparency declaration, it's a $5 fee. And where you required to file both, they are basically a $40 fee for both those filings. Any inspections, searches, or copies of extracts of reported information are $5 each. And a notice, a section 17.1 notice to the administrator. So this is when a corporation, trust, or partnership ceases to be a relevant corporation, relevant trust, or relevant partnership. That's a $30 notice fee. And then an application to omit under Section 40, as we covered earlier, is $30, and an application to correct or change is $150. And that's those fees are set and are available for viewing also on the website. So we've covered a lot of the roles around the LOTA administrator. So I wanted to spend a bit of time just basically a high-level overview of the role of compliance and enforcement. So there is a role of the enforcement officer in LOTA, and that role is very distinct from the administrator. First of all, compliance and enforcement is solely a government function with no role played by the LTSA. In particular, the Minister of Finance may, under LOTA, designate an enforcement officer to be responsible for the general enforcement of the Act, its regulations. Also note that the appointment of an enforcement officer is not mandatory. It is our understanding at this point that the property taxation branch will be assuming the role of enforcement within the government. I'm not going to get into a lot of details about the role of the enforcement officer, given as I don't have the authority to speak to much of it, but at a high level, some of those duties, amongst others, include conducting inspections, obtaining warrants, searching premises for records, making rulings and determinations related to compliance, and issuing various penalties. There's within LOTA, in Division 4 and 6, Part 4 and 6 of LOTA, it covers various types of penalties. There's administrative penalties, and there are also offenses. So I'm not going to, as I mentioned, I'm not going to get into a lot of details around the enforcement function. We'll leave that for a later point when the province is in a position to speak more to that. Administrative infractions are also offenses, as I mentioned. There's administrative offenses and then offenses themselves, and which carry some greater penalties as well. Over to Shannon.
Okay, thank you, Ruben. So this is our website, landtransparency.ca, which you may be familiar with. I just want to do a quick run through of the website to show you some of the resources we have as it's continually being updated with new information. So this is the landing page, and as you can see on the top, there's some categories there: filing, search, enforcement, about, and resources. So first I'm going to show you the filing page. And as you can see, when you go into one of the main categories on the left-hand side, there's subcategories there with more information. So under the filing requirements, there's also information about exclusions from LOTA, the notice under Section 17.1, applications under Section 4042, when to consult a legal professional, and fees for filing. And there's also at the top of the page, under the filing requirements, you can download the administrator's requirements for filing and applications. So those are the administrator's requirements for filing transparency declarations, transparency reports, and the applications and notices. So we do encourage you to read that before filing your LOTA disclosures. Next, on the resources page, we have recently updated this and included some forms. So we have the offline version of the transparency declaration and transparency report available. So this would be declarations and reports that are submitted via paper. And we will have our application and notice offline forms available soon in the coming weeks. But just for now, the transparency declaration and transparency reports are there. And this is good for perhaps gathering information in advance from your clients ahead of November 30th, when declarations will be required. There's also in the resources page a sample of completed transparency report or records. So this includes transparency declarations and transparency reports. The first is a sample for relevant corporation, and the second is a relevant trust. And these are the execution copies that will be shown on the registry, but this is just filled in with information as a variable to show you what they will look like. Also on the resources page, there's the ability to register for a webinar like the one you did today. So we do have another LOTA policy webinar coming up on November 19th, but I wanted to point you in the direction of the system webinar. So on November 3rd and 5th, our colleagues will be doing a system webinar. So this is where you can learn how to file a transparency declaration and a transparency report in My LTSA. So this will give a good overview of the system in advance of November 30th when filings begin. And lastly, under the legislation and government information, there's an unofficial consolidation of the Landowner Transparency Act. So clicking this link will take you to the BC Laws website, and you'll see the consolidated version of LOTA and the regulations for November 30th when filings begin, and also for April 30th when search begins. So please visit our website and take a look at these links. We also encourage everyone to go to the website, and at the bottom of each page, there's a space to input your email to be part of our mailing list. And we do about a weekly or bi-weekly email just telling you about new information that's on the website and any kind of other important information regarding LOTA and LOTA. So I'm just going to pass it back to Ruben quickly to do some closing remarks before we get to the Q&A.
Thanks, Shannon. So just a few closing remarks. As Shannon mentioned, I'd like to echo the importance of taking the time to go through our website. We're continuously pushing out information almost on a weekly basis, and that will continue to be the case from now until November 30th. We can expect to see more forms like the Section 40, Section 42 applications to the administrator, the Section 17.1 notice as well. Those will be continues to be pushed out over the next few weeks. You can expect to also see some training videos that will be recorded as to how to use the system, the LOTA system, how to file. You can expect to see that over the next course of weeks, and also other various links and resources that they become available. As you can see, I think we can all agree that the Landowner Transparency Act and its regulations are very complex. So I really encourage you to take the time to go through the legislation and its regulations. And particularly in the case of, when you're dealing with some complex ownership structures with a chain of relevant intermediaries, it really does require a very in-depth analysis of the relevant sections of the Act in order to trace through the intermediaries to ultimately determine who the interest holders are that must be disclosed within transparency reports. Also, a reminder, November 30th, when the LOTA moves into force and becomes available for filings, that is a Monday. The system itself will be turned on November 30th at 12 a.m. So effectively, if you have deals that may be closing on November 30th, that will be the day where you will be able to start entering information into LOTA. So obviously, you've got to have all of the requisite information about the reporting body, the transferee information, the reporting body information, interest holders and settlors if you're dealing with trusts. So you'll have to have that all ready so that on November 30th, you can actually start entering that information into the LOTA and then prepare your filings. So also to note that if you are closing on the 30th, that you will have to make arrangements to have the certifier from the reporting body available in your office to do the wet ink sign so that you can actually witness that, and then after do the electronic signature, apply your JurisCert electronic signature, and then electronically submit that. The wet ink signed version will be the copy that you retain in your records. Also, we have been getting a lot of questions from legal professionals around interpreting LOTA insofar as certain complex ownership structures, and there are many that I know some of you are dealing with. So if you are having, again, some deals that may be closing in around November 30th and may require some guidance, and if you have some questions, I encourage you to get those questions in sooner rather than later. And you can actually send them to lotr@ltsa.ca. So there are some questions that the administrator from LTSA has the authority to respond to. However, there are some questions that may require to provide its interpretation given its role as enforcement. And if those questions relate to the ones that the province needs to provide guidance on, we will advance them to the province and you will receive a response from the province directly. And that's it. So that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. So